And I found, particularly as a fireman, normally the progress was you went forward in the summer because there's more work, and you went back in the winter as there was less work, and eventually you progressed right through the links. And we used to go from the shunting links to the bottom freight, to the top freight, to the top passenger links, because now you're a young man when you're on the top passenger. And then you work down the passengers to the locals. And eventually now it's come time that you're going to pass out to be a passed fireman, to become a driver. And you've done the same again then as a passed man. In other words, you went for firing but could go driving if you was required.
And then the further you went up, like you're a new starter, and the young drivers would have a cleaner with him, or just passed out. And then the longer you were there, the higher you went to the top link. So eventually, as I got to the top link, you get the best drivers and all the cream.
I was 18 when I was passed out to be able to go firing, but you didn't go firing every day, just when they required you. Of course, in those days, I'm speaking of then, the railways was very busy. Besides the regular workings of trains and goods trains, there was scores and scores of extra trains. So it meant that eventually became passed out as a driver. It's the same thing again, you had an inspector came with you to make sure you're master of the job. He knew you was master of the job as a fireman, but as a driver. And then of course you were passed fireman. So if you wasn't on your own work firing, they could bring you off for a driving job. That was the training as regards getting up to a driver.
When you passed on steam, Sammy Raymond, I always remember him, the local inspector at Leeds, and he took me, and I met him at Rochdale. And I drove a steam engine from Rochdale, and I drove it as far as Wigan. And then we'd come back to Victoria. On the way back in train, he asked me questions. You didn't do no writing, you just answered questions. And then following day he said, meet me at Rochdale at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we went to Newton. So we went to this 5X, and he started up front, and he said, what's that, what it did. Went on footplate then, and he said, what's that? I'd been a fireman for 15 years, and he just answered. And we went to Victoria, and he said, right, go and lose yourself and go back to Newton at 4 o'clock. You're a driver. And that were it.
The first big mainline driving job I did, I worked with a passed fireman called Johnny Featherstone. He was a real gentleman, and whatever happened during the course of your day, he wanted to know. What does that mean? Can you do this? Is that right? And it was bringing you on to the inevitable time when you had to go with the inspector for passing out. But when I was about 18, I fired for Johnny on one of the heaviest jobs we got, which was the Peak Forest Glazebrook. Now this was 42 16-tonners of stone for Lancashire Steel at Earlham, and you had no fitted. Class 8, which were the best brakes ever fitted to any engine. I don't think anybody could surpass the Class 8 for a brake. And we were on it all week together, and we worked the train Monday, Tuesday. On Wednesday, we backed up at Peak Forest, and I went and brew and came back and sat on the fireman's seat. I never said anything. I just put the milk in the can, and there he says, you take it today. And I thought, crikey. So anyway, the guard come up, he says, you're 42 on. Well, a 16-tonner when it's loaded is about 23.5 tons. The guards knew at Buxton they had to hang on, but a guard never knew how good his brakeman was until he got going. So we set off. Well, of course, it was a heavy pull out of the yard at Peak Forest. It was all done very slowly, then over the top at Peak. And all week, of course, as with most Buxton drivers, as soon as you went over the top of these gradients, you started to apply the handbrake on the tender. And this held the train together, putting the engine brake on and taking it off. On those gradients, those locomotives would spring forward. And of course, if the guard's hanging on at the rear, you can snap the couplings. So most of our men used the handbrake very extensively on the tender. So we'd done it Monday and Tuesday. I knew what he wanted. As we went over the top and he shut off, I started to screw the brake on, then put my foot up on it, And then when he started to apply the steam brake, which of course allowed you to get the tender brake on even further, and that's how it was done. So I went over the top and he said, "Do you want the handbrake, the tender brake on?" I said, "Oh yes, please." He said, "Well, you'll have to ask." So we tinkled into Devol's tunnel. Well, the rods were clanging and I kept thinking, God, I hope this engine doesn't pick its wheels up. What shall I do? And of course you used to put your cloth in the palm of your right hand and use the brake, so as the steam brake spindle came out into your cloth in the palm of your hand, and you kept feeling this, and you could hear the engine clank, 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 and you think, is it starting to pick up speed? And I'll tell you what, I hardly breathed. And of course you had to hang on to them for dear life, because if they wanted to stop you at Chinley North Junction, you'd no fitted wagons, that same brake had got to bring all this lot to a standstill. It's about, 42 times 23 tons, wasn't it? So it was a fairish weight. It's 1,000 tons or more. And then in those days, of course, they did not include the weight of the steam engine like they did with the blinking diesels. Anyway, green and in the tunnel, there used to be a distance signal for Devol's tunnel box in the tunnel, if you could see it, and a set of clapper boards and all the rest of it. And came out to the bottom end of the tunnel, and I'm still hanging on to him like grim death. You can see the smoke rising up from the wheels. And anyway, we're doing all right. He was watching what I was doing, you've no need to worry. But it wasn't noticeable. And we approached Chinley, and we were right away. Now then, there were parts of that incline that had little shelves in them, and Chinley Station was one of them, where you came down a gradient, it eased for the station, and then you went down another step. That was the point where you could brake these trains. So with the distance off, you had to then start to let the train run faster. And you'd be doing quite a gallop through Chinley. As you approached the station, you then started to brake heavily, and that then buffered all the wagons up, and as you went over the knob at Chinley Station North, you could feel the train push you over as a solid lot. So you knew you'd not got so many hanging loose that you're going to snap at the rear end, and then of course you've got to get hold of them again. You had another similar thing, but not as bad at Bugsworth. By this time, of course, the brake blocks, if it was dark, you would see everything, the tyres and everything were white hot by this time. You didn't notice it in the daytime. Then you got the distance off for New Mills South Junction, and then you got the viaduct at New Mills, and then you got a slight rise then towards the top of the knob at Disley. You've got to let it go again like you'd done at Chinley, so as it pushed you up this rise, and then you caught it again and buffered it up as you went over the top at Disley, and this sort of thing went on all the way. When I got to Cheadle, I think I was wet through with sweat, and of course I said to him, will you take the tender brake off, because as we went round the corner at Cheadle Heath towards Cheadle Junction, the sewerage works, of course we wanted brakes off to let them run. Then with the climb from Northenden up to the top near Bagley, Withenshaw. And then we got this wonderful step in the track beyond Bagley Station. Once I'd negotiated that, distant off, then I had to get stuck into them to get them up Skelton Junction over the middle line, which was the line to Glazebrook. And as soon as you were over the top of Broadheath there, you had to shut off and get ready, because you were going to go down the bank to Partington. Then it was up Caddy's Head to get them over the canal bridge, and then the worst bit, when everything was well peppered, brakes and everything, you had to drop down on the Glazebrook side and come to a standstill to wait a clear road to drop onto the Manchester-Liverpool line down towards Glazebrook Station, and then push the train back into the sidings. And I thought, crikey, what a performance, 101% concentration. I thought, if I make a beggar of this, I shan't drive again. He never interfered with the way I worked the engine, but he was watching all the time. And when we got back, he says, I think you've done all right there. He says, I'll let you drive on Friday. And we used so much brake on those jobs. Most engines at most depots would go between two washouts without being blocked. Well, the Glazebrook engine used to start off on a Monday. They would probably reblock the tender on a Tuesday. By Thursday, they would be reblocking the engine. We got through so many sets of brake blocks, it was utterly unbelievable, and that's why all our Class 8s had to have more than 2.5 inches on the tyres, because of the heavy braking would turn the tyres. But that was my first big train that to drive in, and I was about 18, I think. And he would quite often, Johnny Featherstone, he would say, "What gradient are we on here?" He had to be able to tell him. He said, "It's no good driving trains on a railroad like this without knowing exactly what your gradient is."